want to start with a window, not a metaphor, an actual window. If you walk along certain streets in St. Petersburg today and you know what you are looking for, you will notice something that the tour guides do not mention and the architecture textbooks do not explain. The ground floor windows of certain 19th century buildings begin below street level. Not slightly below, substantially below. In some cases, the bottom of the window frame sits a full metre beneath the surface of the pavement. The windows are still there, the glass is still in some of them, but the bottom third, sometimes the bottom half, is underground, buried beneath the street that was laid over whatever was there before. The official explanation is drainage, land settling, the gradual accumulation of paving material over decades of urban maintenance. And on the surface, that explanation sounds reasonable. Cities do accumulate, streets do rise over time. This is not controversial as a general principle. But here is what the drainage explanation does not account for: the uniformity. Because those buried windows are not a St. Petersburg anomaly. They are not a Russian peculiarity. Walk the older streets of Paris and you will find the same thing. In London, in Vienna, in Budapest, in cities across North America that were supposedly founded in the early 19th century on virgin ground that had never been built on before. The same windows, the same buried ground floors, the same relationship between the current street level and the base of buildings that the official record describes as constructed at or above that street level. If this was settling or drainage, you would expect variation. You would expect some buildings more affected than others. You would expect the phenomenon to correlate with soil type, with proximity to water, with the specific conditions of individual sites. Instead, what you find is consistency. A global consistency that crosses soil types and climates and geological conditions and produces the same result everywhere the old buildings survive. Something came down, and it came down everywhere at once. Before I go further, I need to place this within the framework we have been building across this series. We have established that the early 19th century experienced a civilizational rupture whose scale the mainstream historical account has never fully absorbed. The atmospheric catastrophe, the reset, the civilization whose fingerprints are visible in the architecture that appears without construction records, in the infrastructure that predates the populations supposedly responsible for building it, in the bones and the asylum admissions and the children processed through systems designed to replace their origins with new ones. We have established that something was already there, before the world we were told began. But we have not yet asked the most direct version of that question. Not what was there in the abstract, not what the bones suggest or the maps imply or the architectural anomalies indicate, but what specifically? What did the cities of the old world look like? What was the physical reality of the civilization that the reset erased? And where exactly did it go? The answer is not far. In most cases, it is directly beneath your feet. Let me tell you what the mud flood hypothesis actually proposes, because I think it is frequently misrepresented in ways that make it easier to dismiss than it deserves to be. The mud flood is not a theory about a single catastrophic flood event in the conventional sense. It is not proposing a tsunami or a river overflow or a biblical deluge. What it proposes is something more specific and in some ways more remarkable. A sudden and massive deposition of sediment across a global scale. Not water in the sense of a wave, something thicker, something that moved more slowly but covered more completely. That filled the lower floors of existing structures. That buried the ground level of an existing civilization under meters of material that then consolidated and was built upon by the populations that came after. The physical evidence for this is not subtle once you know what to look for, and I want to walk through it carefully because this is where the hypothesis moves from speculation into something that the evidence actually supports. Start with the buildings themselves. Across every major city in the Northern Hemisphere, there exists a category of 19th century structure whose lower floors present a specific anomaly. The architectural detailing of the buried floors matches or exceeds the detailing of the floors above. Windows that are now below street level have the same ornamental stonework, the same proportional relationship to the facade, the same quality of construction as the windows visible above ground. If these floors were basements designed to be below grade, the architecture would reflect that. Basements in 19th century construction are utilitarian. They do not have ornamental window surrounds. They do not have the proportional grammar of a principal facade. These buried floors were not designed to be underground. They were designed to be seen. They were the ground floor of a building whose relationship to street level was entirely different from the relationship that exists today. Something changed that relationship. Something raised the street level by 1, 2, sometimes 3 meters across entire cities simultaneously. And whatever that something was, it happened fast enough that the buildings remained standing through it, were not demolished, were not rebuilt, were simply incorporated into a new street level that buried their lower floors and left their upper floors available for the populations that came after to occupy, to renovate, and eventually to describe in official records as buildings constructed at their current ground level. Now I want to talk about Paris specifically. Because Paris is where the physical evidence is most accessible and most extensively documented and most consistently ignored by the mainstream architectural history of the city. The Paris catacombs are one of the most visited tourist sites in France. 6 million visitors per year descend into the tunnels beneath the city to walk among the bones of 6 million dead relocated there in the late 18th century from overcrowded cemeteries. The official history of the catacombs is well established. The tunnels were originally limestone quarries that supplied the building material for the city above. When the cemeteries became a public health crisis, the bones were moved into the decommissioned quarry tunnels. The result is the ossuary that tourists visit today. That is the official history, and it is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in a way that matters. Because the tunnel system beneath Paris is not limited to the sections that are officially open to visitors. The accessible catacombs represent a small fraction of a network that extends beneath the entire city and whose full extent has never been officially mapped to a resolution that satisfies independent researchers who have attempted to verify the official surveys. The network is vast, it is old, and in sections that are not officially accessible and not officially mapped, there are structures that the quarry hypothesis does not account for. Rooms with architectural finishing, not rough quarry walls, finished walls, plastered surfaces. Evidence of occupation that predates the documented use of those sections as quarry tunnels. Doorways with the proportional grammar of surface architecture, rather than the utilitarian openings of an underground industrial facility. In some documented cases, ceilings of a height that suggests the room was not originally underground at all. That suggests the room was once at surface level and the surface came to it rather than the room being excavated downward. Independent researchers who have documented these sections, and there is a community of urban explorers in Paris called cataphiles who have been mapping the unofficial network for decades, consistently describe finding evidence of occupation at depths that the official timeline of the city cannot explain. Artifacts, construction techniques, architectural details that belong to a surface building tradition rather than a subterranean one. What are finished surface rooms doing 30 feet below the streets of Paris? The official answer is that they are not there, that the Catafar reports are exaggerated or misinterpreted, that what looks like architectural finishing is natural limestone formation or the remnant of documented quarry infrastructure. The official answer is dismissal dressed as explanation. But the Catafal documentation is extensive, it is photographic, it is specific about location and depth and the physical characteristics of what has been found, and it is consistent across decades of independent observation by people who have no particular investment in any historical hypothesis and every reason to report accurately what they are looking at. Something is down there, something whose architectural character belongs to a surface civilization rather than a subterranean one. Something that is 30 feet below the current street level of one of the most extensively studied cities in the world, and has generated in the mainstream academic literature on Parisian history and archaeology almost no serious attention. Now London, because the pattern repeats, and the London version of it has a specific characteristic that I find particularly difficult to set aside. The Thames, the river that defines the city's geography and has shaped its development for 2,000 years of documented history. The Thames today runs at a level that requires a city to be defended against it by an extensive flood barrier system. The Thames historically ran higher relative to the city than it does today, or the city's relationship to the Thames has changed in ways that the standard account of urban development does not fully explain. But here is the specific thing. In the documented excavations that have been conducted along the Thames foreshore and beneath the streets of the City of London, the oldest layer of the city, archaeologists consistently find evidence of Roman and medieval occupation at depths that suggest the current street level of central London sits several metres above the surface level at which those civilizations operated. The official explanation is gradual accumulation, the same drainage and settling argument that is offered for Saint Petersburg and Paris. But the Roman structures found beneath London are not just foundations. They are complete ground floors, with surfaces, with thresholds, with the architectural relationship to their surroundings that indicates they were built to be at street level. At a street level that is now buried under metres of material, whose deposition the official account distributes across centuries of gradual urban accumulation. Centuries of gradual accumulation do not produce the uniform deposition depth that the archaeological record shows. Gradual accumulation is uneven. It follows drainage patterns and construction activity and the specific history of individual sites. What the London excavations show is a consistency of burial depth across the entire central area of the city that points not to gradual accumulation, but to a single depositional event of significant scale. Something covered London. Something covered Paris. Something covered St. Petersburg at roughly the same depth, in roughly the same period. Leaving the upper floors of existing structures available and the lower floors sealed beneath a new ground level that the populations who came after accepted as the surface the city had always sat on, and the date that the physical evidence points toward, the period when the depositional layer was laid down and the new street level established, falls in the decades immediately preceding 1847. Which means the cities we inherited were not built in the 19th century, they were uncovered in it. That is the distinction I want to hold on to, because I think it changes everything about how we read the official history of urban development in this period. The standard account describes the 19th century as an era of unprecedented construction, the Industrial Revolution, the expansion of the railways, the growth of cities from modest market towns into the metropolitan centres we recognise today. And the physical evidence of that construction is real. The railways were built, the factories were constructed, the infrastructure of industrial civilization was laid down in this period in ways that are extensively documented. But underneath that documented construction layer, there is another layer, a layer that was not built in the 19th century, that was already there when the 19th century began, that was uncovered, repurposed, built upon, and incorporated into the new urban fabric with a speed that the official account of 19th century construction has never adequately explained. Because here is the problem with the standard timeline. The cities of the early 19th century grew faster than the documented workforce, the documented material supply, and the documented capital investment can account for. London's population doubled between 1800 and 1850. The infrastructure required to support that population, the sewers, the water systems, the streets, the public buildings, the institutional architecture, appears in the record with a completeness and a quality that the available construction resources of the period should not have been able to produce, unless significant portions of that infrastructure were already there, unless the 19th century city was built not from scratch, but on top of and around and inside a pre-existing urban fabric whose origins the new civilization did not document, because documenting them would have required acknowledging what they were. Now I want to talk about Washington, D.C., because the American capital presents a version of this problem that is in some ways the most direct and in some ways the most carefully managed. Washington, D.C. was officially founded in 1790. The story is well known. A planned city, a designed capital, laid out on swampy ground between the Potomac and Anacostia rivers, on land that had no prior urban development. The l'enfant plan, the grid, the ceremonial avenues radiating from the Capitol and the White House. A city built from nothing according to a deliberate design by a new nation establishing its permanent seat of government. That is the official story. And like every official story in this investigation, it contains enough truth to function as a cover for what it omits. The omission in the Washington story begins with the buildings, the Capitol, the White House, the original federal buildings that were supposedly constructed on virgin ground by a young nation with limited resources in the decade following 1790. These buildings, in their original form before the reconstructions and expansions of the 19th century, display a quality of construction and a sophistication of architectural detailing that the documented workforce and material resources of the federal city's first decade cannot account for. The marble, the stone cutting, the proportional systems, the relationship between the buildings and the ceremonial landscape they inhabit, all of it points to a level of technical capability and institutional knowledge that a newly independent nation building its first major public structures on an undeveloped site simply did not have. Not in 1793. Not with the workforce that the construction records document. Not with the supply chains that the period's infrastructure could have supported. Unless the site was not undeveloped. Unless the ceremonial landscape of Washington, D.C., the alignments, the sight lines, the proportional relationships between the major buildings was not designed by l'enfant from scratch, but was inherited from something already present on the ground. Something whose geometry l'enfant mapped and formalized and incorporated into his plan without acknowledging its origin. Because acknowledging its origin would have required explaining what it was and where it had come from. The survey markers, the alignment of Pennsylvania Avenue, the specific angles of the radiating streets. When independent researchers have analysed the geometry of the l'enfant plan in detail, they find a level of mathematical precision that is consistent with surveying an existing landscape rather than designing a new one. The angles are too exact, the relationships are too complex, the sight lines too carefully calibrated for a plan produced in the field conditions of an undeveloped site in the 1790s with the surveying technology of the period. L'Enfant was not designing Washington. He was mapping something that was already there. And the something that was already there, the pre-existing geometry that the federal city was laid out on top of, points in its proportional system and its architectural character to exactly the civilization whose fingerprints we have been following across this entire series. Now I want to bring this back to the burial, to the specific question of what happened in the decades before 1847 and why that date keeps appearing at the centre of the physical evidence. The depositional layer. The material that raised street levels across every major city in the Northern Hemisphere and buried the ground floors of the existing buildings. What was it? Where did it come from? And how was it deposited with the speed and the uniformity that the physical evidence requires? The standard geological explanation for rapid, widespread sediment deposition is a flood event. Water carries sediment. Water recedes, sediment remains. And on a large enough scale, a flood event can deposit material uniformly across a wide area in a short time. But the material in the depositional layer beneath the streets of Paris and London and Saint Petersburg and Washington is not flood sediment in the standard geological sense. Its composition varies by location in ways consistent with local geology. It contains organic material consistent with rapid burial rather than slow accumulation. And in some documented cases, it contains artifacts, objects, material culture of the civilization that was buried under it, not washed in from elsewhere, present in the layer as if they were simply covered where they stood, as if the deposition happened around them rather than carrying them from somewhere else. That is not flood behavior. That is burial behavior. The material came down on top of what was already there, rather than sweeping it away. And what was already there remained in place underneath, intact enough in many cases to be occupied immediately by the populations that appeared in these cities in the decades following the depositional event. Because that is the other anomaly that the standard account of 19th century urban history has never explained: the speed of reoccupation. The cities that appear in the historical record as established urban centres in the 1820s and 1830s and 1840s, with populations and infrastructure and institutional complexity that should have required generations to develop, were not built up gradually from small settlements. They appear in the record already formed, already functioning, already possessed of the architectural fabric and the urban infrastructure of mature cities. Because they were mature cities, they had been mature cities before the depositional event, and after the event, the populations that came to them, or the populations that survived in them, did not need to build from scratch. They needed only to clear the upper floors, to establish a new street level on top of the depositional layer, to repurpose and rename and redocument what was already standing, and to not ask where it had come from. That is what 1847 represents in this investigation, not the date of the burial. The burial happened earlier, in the catastrophic years of the early 19th century, in the period we have been identifying across this series as the terminal moment of the Old World civilization. 1847 is the date by which the reoccupation was complete, by which the new populations had established themselves thoroughly enough in the inherited urban fabric that the question of the fabric's origin had been administratively closed, filed, replaced by a documented history that began with the new civilization's arrival and said nothing about what had been there before. The cities were not built before 1847. They were buried before 1847. And what was built before 1847 was not the cities. It was the story of the cities, the documented history, the official record, the administrative framework that replaced the origin of the inherited urban fabric with a new origin that the new civilization could claim as its own. That replacement is what we have been living inside ever since, and the evidence of what it replaced is still there. 30 feet below the streets of Paris, behind the buried windows of Saint Petersburg, in the geometric alignments of Washington that L'Enfant mapped but did not design, in the construction quality of buildings whose official histories begin in the early 19th century and whose physical character belongs to something older and more complete than a young civilization building its first cities on new ground. The city was always there. It is still there. Directly beneath the one we were told was the first, and the closer you look at the street level, at the buried windows and the underground rooms and the depositional layer that sits between what was and what we were given instead, the harder it becomes to accept the story that was built on top of it. The next video goes somewhere the physical evidence has been pointing since the beginning of this series. I think you are ready for it now. See you there.